Kia ora tātou. Ko David Toombs tōko ingoa. Warm welcome to everyone here in the room with us. It's great to see you this evening. Everyone who's watching this lecture online, it's good to have you with us. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Professor Cyril Hovorun, Director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute and at Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles. Cyril is currently doing something of a tour of Pacific institutions, including Australia and New Zealand, and we're absolutely delighted that you've included us in your busy agenda. Cyril is a graduate of the Theological Academy in Kiev and the National University in Athens. He completed his doctoral studies at Durham University in the UK. He served as the chairman of the Department for External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the first deputy chairman of the Educational Committee of the Russian Orthodox Church. Later, he did his research as a fellow at Yale and Columbia Universities and as a visiting professor at the University of Munster in Germany. His books include Eastern Christianity in its Texts, 2022, and co-authorship of Political Orthodoxies, the Unorthodoxies of the Church Coerced. This evening, Cyril will talk to us about Ukraine, post-colonialism, and biblical theology, and there should be time for Q&A when we've heard his presentation. Please welcome Cyril Hovorun.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming to this event, to this public lecture. I'll try not to disappoint you much. At least I'll try to experiment tonight. Something that people don't usually do. They usually don't connect post-colonial studies and Ukraine. We don't do it in Ukraine, certainly. And when I would kind of speak about this in Ukraine, about Ukraine and colonial studies, they would probably anathematize me because we don't like to be seen as a subject of colonial studies, even though it is completely applicable to Ukraine, this field of studies, post-colonial studies, and I'm going to argue why so. Usually when we perceive colonialism and post-colonialism, we have in mind, by definition, by default, the overseas colonies. We keep in mind like Spanish or Portuguese or Dutch or British empires having their colonies overseas, or the German Empire having their colonies overseas, and exploiting their resources, oppressing their people, and so forth. However, I would say it's just a part of the colonial history, the overseas colonialism. There was, and there is still, what I would call internal colonialism, or the colonialism of neighborhood. Close to this island, such a case, I believe, is, for example, Timor-Leste. I visited Timor-Leste on my way to Australia and to New Zealand. I had a chance to teach there at the Catholic University, and it was a very enlightening experience for me when I realized there is such a proximity, such a similarity between Timor-Leste and its own experience of colonialism from Indonesia and of my own country. Because Timor-Leste, as you know, it's like on the same island with the Western Timor, which used to be a part of the Dutch colonial power and then became a part of Indonesia. So basically, after Portugal decided to get rid of its colonies after its own revolution in 1975. Indonesia invaded Timor-Leste because it was the same island. And they believed that, Suharto tried to convince, for example, Gerald Ford that, well, they are kind of Indonesians, they want to speak Bahasa, and they don't want to be Timorese and so forth. Something that Putin believed about Ukraine. Now they are Russian-speaking, they don't want to be a part of, be independent, a part of the West, so let's go and take them. So it's exactly an example of internal colonization, Timor-Leste. So it doesn't need to be overseas, like in this case. Or, for example, take Germany. Nazi Germany, that the Anschluss of Austria, it was an example of internal colonization, basically speaking, right? And then the expansion of Germany further to the east, next to Germany, to create this Lebensraum, the living space for Germany, it was exactly an example of internal colonization. So they didn't have to go overseas, even though Nazi Germany, tried to preserve its overseas colonies. They established, as you probably know, after the World War I, after Germany lost in World War I, it lost all its colonies overseas, like in Papua New Guinea or in Central Africa, like in Namibia, and or Togoland. And then under the Third Reich, they re-established an office for colonies. They even, not many people know this, but they wanted to use Madagascar, for example, to solve the Jewish question. They wanted to export all Jews to Madagascar and to extinguish that there. But then they realized it's too expensive, and Germans, they know how to count money, and they decided to do it in-house in Europe. But that was a part of the German colonial history. So Germany had both external and internal colonies. My point is that what we are facing nowadays in Ukraine or Eastern Europe, it's a colonial war fought in the framework of this internal colonization. Have a look at this picture. This one. It's from the National Geographic from 1972. It's the Soviet Union. And this picture shows different peoples, ethnicities that inhabited the Soviet Union. Here you can clearly see that the Soviet Union was not a monolithic state. It was really a variety of different colonies, people who were forced to join the Soviet Union. Like, for example, Ukraine. In Ukraine, we had from 1917 through 1921, we had a People's Republic, independent republic, and then we were conquered basically by the Soviet Russia. And in the same way, many other peoples that inhabited the Soviet Union were essentially conquered and assimilated to the extent that their languages are gone. Sometimes those people are gone. For example, in the war in Ukraine nowadays, many people who are sent to the front line to be killed in masses are those minorities. And this is like a policy of Putin to draft as many people as possible from those minorities in order to extinguish them, basically. So it's a continuation of this colonization. That's why we have a lot of Buryats, for example. They are Buddhists. They are a completely different ethnicity from the Russians. They speak their own language, and they get killed in masses. They are one of the most killed minority in Ukraine. So this is like an example of internal colonization, which had all the implications of the colonizations, of all colonizations. In Timor-Leste, in Dili, I met the cardinal there, and we had a conversation, and all of a sudden, kind of something triggered him, and he started mentioning his childhood when they were hiding in the mountains near Dili, when they were bombarded by the airplanes, Indonesian airplanes. They were actually British airplanes. Indonesia bought them from Britain, and how they were to hide, how they were deprived of food, and that's exactly the story of what we experience nowadays in Ukraine, what we experienced in the past, because for us, what we're experiencing now, it's just a return of what used to be in the past. This is Holodomor. It's famine, which was created artificially by Stalin in order exactly to break the backbone of the society, of the Ukrainian society, when 4 to 7 million people died, including children. This is exactly an illustration of these internal colonial policies. The same was like in the Free State of Congo under Leopold II. He applied the same policies, and elsewhere where there was a colonial power. In Ukraine, we suffered also from the German colonization, because, as you probably know, Ukraine was completely occupied by the Nazi Germany, and so we were between the Anno and Hammer. So in the early 30s, we had this Holodomor, the massive extinction by the by Moscow. And then the German occupation came, and we experienced something very similar with a huge loss of population. 5 to 7 million lives in Ukraine were lost as a result of the now German internal colonization of Ukraine, as it were. Including, like, for example, my great-grandfather, he was murdered by Germans. So it's a part of everyone's story in Ukraine. Also, sometimes I say that people usually don't perceive white people as slaves or children of slaves. And I say, I am a grandchild of a slave. And this is literally so, because my grandmother was brought against her will as a labor force to Germany when she was a teenager. And she was a slave at least for some period of time. She was not born a slave, even though I would argue, because if you are born in the Soviet Union, you're kind of half of slave. And then she was brought to literally slavery in Germany. So it's like a part of our history and our identity, even though we would not put this in these ways, in these terms. We don't usually describe our history in those colonial terms, but I think they are completely applicable to us. And of course, then the story of the of the extinction of Jews, when in Baba Yar in Kiev, up to 150,000 Jews were killed. Not only Jews, but mostly Jews, of course. And this is another example of colonization. Then, after the World War II, as you probably know, a new era came. An era when colonialism was condemned, there was a consistent policy, international policy to fight colonialism, with landmarks like, for example, the famous conference in Bandung in 1955, which proclaimed a new era, which gave a lot of hopes, of course, but those hopes faded away quite soon because people realized there is something else which looks like, which doesn't look like colonialism, but could be something like colonialism emerged, which was branded and coined as a word by Jean-Paul Sartre as neocolonialism. Neocolonialism, quite paradoxically, it's a Western concept. It emerged from the French academia, from the French intellectual circles, but it was adopted quite well in the global South, and that's why we had this beautiful, wonderful book by the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, on neocolonialism, where he argued that neocolonialism is a new reality emerging instead of the old colonies, and basically it meant that yes, the direct control of the colonial powers over the colonies is gone, but it was substituted by many indirect controls, including through money, investments, through political proxies, parties and movements, and cultural influence, the church, religion, and so forth. That's what the first president of Indonesia, Sukarno, called that colonialism is not dead, it has changed its clothes. So neocolonialism is just another clothes of colonialism. Still, neocolonialism is very much active. Like, for example, if you take Africa, yes, usually we kind of connect neocolonialism with the old colonial powers, but for example, in Africa, it's not exactly the case. As you know, there is an ongoing war in eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo with a really very violence and violence against women, in particular against children, that has claimed around 6 million lives. And it is fought not by the Western powers, it is fought by Rwanda, which had suffered itself from genocide. Rwanda has lost around 800,000 people. I've been to both countries, actually. I recently was in the Democratic Republic of Congo, so it's a very fresh impression for me. When we visited Hovorun, which is an institution established by the governance of the DRC to investigate the cases of violence. And it's fought, yes, Rwanda says we don't do anything, in Congo, in the DRC, but instead they use proxy powers like M23 group, which acts as it is independent, but it's not. It's under the complete control by Rwanda. Or the neocolonial efforts of China and Russia in Africa, which is really, we could call their effort a second scramble for Africa, basically, for the resources, for the people, for the governance, and so forth. My fresh experience, I was flying from Zambia, from Lusaka to Zimbabwe, to Harare, and on the plane, half of the plane were Chinese people, and half of the Chinese were party members. You immediately can see them, you can distinguish them. At least I have a trained eye on the party members. And that is kind of reality. And then the Russian, of course, the Russian influence, the Russian presence of the two arms of Russia, the soft powers and the hard power. The hard power is the former Wagner Group. Now it has been rebranded as African Corp. They are basically mercenaries who fight for different governments or against governments, depending on the interests of Russia. The recent reports about the Russian atrocities in Mali, they are really horrible, what they've done. Only recently we started learning about them, and they were committed exactly in the same period of time, the same weeks as Russia, for example, started invading Ukraine. So that same time when when Bucha happened in Ukraine, the same days, something similar was happening in Mali by the Russian mercenaries, by the Wagner Group. They killed people indiscriminately, they raped women, and they killed children and so forth. And Russia has the soft power in Africa, which is the church, Russian Orthodox Church, which used to be my church, actually. I need to make a disclosure. I worked very closely. I was a personal secretary to Patriarch Cyril of Moscow for 10 years. So I know kind of how it is happening from within. And I kind of testify to that. I'm a witness to these policies, and can say that the Russian Church willingly cooperates with the Kremlin in helping the Kremlin to pursue its policies in Russia, and those are basically the policies of neocolonization. It's neocolonialism in its classical form, in the form as it was defined by Jean-Paul Sartre or Sukarno or others. Sometimes they help each other. There are recent reports, for example, that the Russian Church would recruit students of theology in various African countries, especially in Kenya, like Kenya, Tanzania, in Eastern Africa, enticing them to go and study in Russia theology, Orthodox theology, and then they get recruited to the front line and get killed or killed. So that's how those soft power and hard power intertwine, and this is all in the name of neocolonization. So basically they practice neocolonization in Africa in order to enhance their neocolonial or colonial efforts in Ukraine. In 1991, Ukraine became independent. And that was clearly a kind of anti-colonial step. We became independent just like most other African countries, or countries like in Oceania, those who used to be colonies became independent. That was a clear anti-colonial step. Russia said, okay. At the time, the president of Russia was Boris Yeltsin, who used to say that every morning you wake up, you need to think what you can do for Ukraine, for independent Ukraine. I don't know if he meant it, but certainly it sounded like, okay, we get rid of this kind of colonial past, we let Ukraine go, and we should accept the independence of Ukraine. At the same time, the same president, Yeltsin, of course, waged a very brutal colonial war in Chechnya, for example, when he basically razed the city of Grozny, the same way how the city of Dili, for example, in Timor-Leste was completely razed and everyone was killed almost everyone was killed by the Indonesian invading forces at the time. So Grozny was completely eliminated, and well, hundreds of thousands of people died. It was clearly a colonial war, but at least for some time Yeltsin left Ukraine to be independent. It changed with Putin coming to power, and Putin started actually applying very systematically neo-colonial attitudes everywhere, not just in Ukraine, but in other parts of the world. He famously said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the largest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and he wanted to reverse this catastrophe, as he called it, which meant basically to return from anti-colonial movement back to colonialism. Nowadays, in the, kind of this time in the form of neo-colonialism. So Putin tried different soft powers, different approaches which are classical from the playbooks of neo-colonialism, meaning investing Russian money into economies in order to create as many strings as possible, exporting corruption, because Russia is like the generator of corruption. And it's not that we are completely innocent, like in Ukraine. We collaborated with Russia in corruption, certainly, but the corruption was generated in Russia, and the purpose was exactly through corruption to create the common space, both economic and mental and social space of corruption. Something I believe China is trying to do across the globe, by exporting corruption and trying to buy out, basically, loyalty and allegiances and so forth. Then, of course, cultural expansion, and then, of course, religious expansion. That's how the Russian Church started using its own infrastructure or structures across the post-Soviet space, what they call the post-Soviet space, in order to reattach those spaces back to Russia, to the Kremlin, especially given that in Russia there was the spiritual revival after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when religion became again free to practice, and they spoke about the religious revival, and this religious revival became another instrument of neo-colonization in Ukraine and elsewhere. However, these neo-colonial efforts did not work well always for Putin. I would say in most cases it did not work for him. And a huge frustration for Putin was in Georgia. In Georgia, Republic of Georgia, which toppled its kind of corrupt Soviet-style, Soviet-era president, Shevardnadze, and elected a new president, Saakashvili. And that was kind of a major blow to Putin. And Putin, for the first time, tried something different than neo-colonial approach. He tried to come back to the old style of colonialism. Started a colonial war. That's how in August 2008, he invaded Georgia. And he occupied parts of that country. That occupation still works. And that was clearly colonial war in Europe, we could say, because Georgia at the time was very much on the track to join the European Union. So interestingly, that in Georgia, how it worked, a part of 20% of the country is occupied by the Russian army nowadays, and that was a kind of colonial, right? Classical colonial occupation. And yet it worked very well in order to reestablish also a neo-colonial power. So Putin managed to establish a government through corruption, through a guy whose name was Ivanishvili. He was like the oligarch, the only oligarch in Georgia. And through him, through his government, Putin managed to establish a neo-colonial power in Georgia. So basically, Georgia is part of Georgia is now under colonial rule of Russia, the occupied one. And then another part, the remaining part of Georgia, is under neo-colonial rule of Putin. Then Ukraine. Ukraine is of course, is much larger, and Ukraine has a very important symbolic meaning for Putin. He is really irrational. He is really passionate. He is obsessed when it comes to Ukraine. I don't know for what reason, but he's like that serial abuser who kind of was denied, and he keeps chasing his victim. And the relationship of Putin with Ukraine was the same dialectics of colonialism, neocolonialism, and postcolonialism. As you probably know, in Ukraine, it was on the news, there were two revolutions. The first one was the revolution of the Orange Revolution in 2004 and 2005. When there was a presidential election, there were presidential elections. There were two candidates, Yanukovych and Yushchenko. The elections were rigged, and they were manipulated, and people put to the main square of Kyiv, of the capital, which we call Maidan of the independence, and that's how the first Maidan happened. As a revolution that protested against the manipulation of the elections, and eventually President Yushchenko was elected as the president, was confirmed as the president of Ukraine. I interpret that Maidan as an anti-colonial revolution. Anti-colonial in the sense of anti-neocolonial revolution, because Yanukovych was certainly a proxy agent for neocolonization of Russia. He was the candidate of Moscow, and they promoted him as their own guy in Kyiv, and that was a part of neocolonial effort by Moscow. And what happened in Kyiv at the time was basically an anti-neocolonial revolt. The second one, yes, Putin, I mean, after 2004, Yushchenko lost the elections in 2009. Yanukovych eventually was elected. Well, the elections were fair, no manipulations. He was fairly elected as the president. But Putin saw it as a kind of another chance for neocolonization of Ukraine through Yanukovych. And Yanukovych basically carried out his plan, Putin's plan. And the people resisted and revolted against him. That's how the second Maidan happened, which was the Revolution of Dignity 2013, 2014. All those pictures, by the way, are mine. I just remember all those events. I participated in them. It's a part of my personal story. And that was a second anti-neocolonial revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan. So I would interpret them in those events as anti-neocolonial events. And that's why I would present this recent story of revolts and resistance and resilience in Ukraine as a series of basically anti-colonial and anti-neocolonial events. In the Maidans, it was an anti-neocolonial resistance. When the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 won against all odds, and we could say that the anti-neocolonial revolution became successful, Putin realized that neocolonialism would not work anymore in Ukraine. And he decided to go straight to a colonial war. That's how he annexed Crimea and started a proxy war in Donbass, in the east of Ukraine, which was clearly, kind of classically, a colonial war, when you try to regain your territory under your direct control. Not through the proxies, not through local authorities' powers like Yanukovych. So Putin realized neocolonialism doesn't work in Ukraine because it always receives this very harsh pushback from the Maidans, and he started basically a colonial war. And yet it was a bit nuanced. He annexed Crimea. Crimea, he said, it's mine. Okay, no questions. It's out of question. But in the east, in the case of the republics, the so-called People's Republic of Donetsk and Luhansk, he established them as a kind of independent republics, which was a kind of neocolonial approach when you implant a proxy in order to control the territory that you want to control. So his plan was to kind of implant those bodies, those two republics, into the Ukrainian political body in order to control the entire body through those republics. It was a kind of mixed colonial, neo-colonial, just like what he did in Georgia, had done in Georgia. Because in Georgia, remember, there were, by the way, also two republics, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, that he had occupied in 2008, which were kind of parts of Russia now, at least from his perspective, interpretation. So that was kind of the pieces that he grabbed as a part of his colonial effort. And then Tbilisi itself, the rest of the country, he put it under the neo-colonial rule of Ivanishvili, of his proxy, right? So he tried to do the same in Ukraine. Colonial power, reestablished colonial power in Crimea, and then neo-colonial control through the proxy kind of quasi-independent republics in the east of Ukraine. That did not work as well, because we kept fighting. Even though the West actually accepted this colonial rule over Crimea, de facto. And actually they forced, the Western powers forced Ukraine to accept this reality. So we basically, even though rhetorically we said, yes, Crimea is ours, but in fact, we decided, okay, it's gone. With the hope that it would bring peace to Ukraine. It wouldn't, it didn't. Because Putin used Crimea as a platform to launch the big war in February 2022. And that big war in 2022 happened, I believe, because of his frustration with his neo-colonial attempts to again reestablish his colonial power in Ukraine. Actually, the election of President Zelensky was a part of his neo-colonial hopes. He hoped that Zelensky would be a sort of like Yanukovych, you know, a guy through whom he could control the situation in Ukraine. And of course, he was mistaken. I myself, I never kind of voted for Zelensky, you know, he was never my president. But of course, I support him as a president. But still, I mean, he was elected exactly as a sort of neo-colonial, you know, guy. But when Putin realized that it doesn't work the way how he wanted it to work, he started again a new colonial war, which was in February 2022. When he tried to colonize, to retake the entire territory. And that's why we interpret, well, at least I interpret, this big war against Ukraine as a classical colonial war. When you come and you conquer and you say, enough is enough. Well, no more time for plays, you know, for those games of pretension. We just want to reestablish control. Well, it's basically something similar to what Indonesia did with Timor-Leste. They tried to play with some independence, kind of pro-Indonesian parties in Timor-Leste, and they decide, no, enough is enough. We just go and occupy it, you know. And that's how the big war began. And it continues to be really an anti-colonial war from our perspective. It also continues to be a sort of Maidans from our perspective. For us, this resistance to Putin's war is like the continuation of the Maidans we had. But in the Maidans, we resisted the neo-colonial effort. Now we resist the colonial effort without any neo, you know, attached to it. That's our outlook. From the Russian perspective, it's different. Let me now go to the Russian side and try to explain how they see it. So they see it basically that Ukraine is a part of the Russian world. This doctrine, which is a new ideological scheme, developed mostly by the church. And I saw it kind of in making when I observed it when it was like a puppy, you know, in the cradle. It was really, sometimes looked like cozy. But at that time already I realized I had this gut feeling that this puppy is going to be like a monster. And so originally it was not so scary. But it grew to a scary thing, a beast. This was done, this cradle, he was like an incubator which was inside the church. This Russian world presupposes a very strict colonization of all areas under its control. It's stricter than even as it was envisaged by the Soviet Union. If you go here, to the situation of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, the policies were to accommodate some kind of ethnic identities within the Soviet Union. they did not allow too much, but at least they allowed to speak some Ukrainian, for example, as Ukrainians. It was discouraged indirectly in different ways. Like, for example, people would treat you, you speak Ukrainian, you are like a village person, if you want to make a career, if you want to pretend to be modern, you should speak Russian, this kind of pressure. But still, ethnic identities, languages were somehow tolerated, sometimes even kind of very cautiously encouraged. It's not the case with the Russian world. It's like a complete elimination of every single identity except Russian. So the Russian world means that you can speak only Russian, you can have only a Russian identity, you may have a Ukrainian surname, it's okay. But the more Ukrainian is your origin, the more you should be fighting against Ukraine. That's why Putin purposely puts people with a Ukrainian background who were born in Ukraine or have Ukrainian surnames as generals, as negotiators. For example, Dmitriev, this guy who is now negotiates with Trump on behalf of Putin, he has Ukrainian background. He was born in Ukraine. Even the general kind of the chief generals in Putin's army, especially like the spokesman for the Putin's army, Konashenkov, it's like a changed name from the Ukrainian Konashenko, which is a Ukrainian surname. So apparently he had the Ukrainian background. And Putin purposely put people with the Ukrainian background to say, look, these are real Ukrainians, not you. And these real Ukrainians will fight you, will kill you. And everything which is not Russian, like if you dare to speak Ukrainian, for example, he would call you a Nazi. That's why we all become Nazis. All Ukrainians are Nazis, because we speak our own language, because we dare to have our own identity. From the perspective of the Russian world, which is the difference from the Soviet time, everything which is not Russian is Nazi, basically, and Russophobic. That is the Russian, and they also try to explain this biblically and theologically. Hence is the biblical part of my presentation. The last one I'm concluding now. The Russians perceive their mission as civilizational, as a global, as a cosmic. Putin himself and before him Patriarch Kirill described this war as a cosmic battle against the forces of evil. It's a bit Manichaean, a bit Gnostic and dualistic when they see, the world being divided in black and white, when they see Russia as the white part of the world, the incarnated goodness, as it were, and the rest of the world, especially the West, as incarnated evil. And for them, it's like the cosmic battle against the forces of evil, and Ukraine is the battlefield, basically. The Gnostics had very strange ideas. For example, they believe that up there, they believe that actually the moon and the stars are the incarnation of evil. And they believe that some pieces of, and sun is the incarnation of goodness. And they believe that in some parts of the world, there are pieces of goodness, like vegetables. And they ate vegetables with the idea that they would release those good parts eventually, of goodness to rejoin the sun, the essential goodness. So the kind of the idea, I try to explain how Putin, of course he would not explain it in the same way, but that's how they work. They want to consume Ukraine in order to release what is good, what is remaining good. In it, to rejoin the powers of goodness, which is the Russian world, which is basically Russia. And they also have biblical explanation for that. I just want to bring an example of a documentary which was produced by a TV channel which is run by the Russian Orthodox Church. It's called Spas, Savior channel, and the documentary is called The War and the Bible. It is a conversation between two people, the editor-in-chief of this channel, Korchevnikov, and a priest. The priest is a graduate of the Moscow Theological Academy. You can see him on the right with a beard. Apparently, that's the priest. He looks very priestly. And an icon, of course, of Christ on his helmet. And they are talking. They have a conversation. This conversation in Debaltsevo. It's one of the cities which were completely destroyed by the Russian invasion in Donbass. And they have a biblical conversation, how to interpret this kind of destruction. And And that's their conversation. It's in Russian, but I also, you will see the translation of this conversation into English, which is a very interesting, very short, but very telling conversation. So let me, that's how it looks like. So that's how they kind of, this is a kind of theological conversation in Russia. You can imagine the setting and the appearance. And these are the references to the biblical stories about Jesus of Navin and the biblical stories. So you can see, like, there are some scenes of the destroyed Ukrainian city, and then there are some biblical scenes from some popular movies or documentaries, I don't know. Basically the conversation is like this. So the priest, Igor Fomin, he says, how to understand the biblical phrase, go and slaughter, destroy the nation. And Korchennikov says, many liberals would now say, no, even a ruler has no right to take a life. So they always refer to liberals, because for them, liberals are the evil, always the most evil guys. And he says, well, the liberals will say, no, it's not good to kill people, And then Fomin responds to him that the scripture says the exact opposite. And he says that kind of Joshua and Moses, they stood for something different. Go and destroy, regardless of what you feel, how pity you feel about those people. Your task, your mission is to destroy those people. This is the commandment of God, and if you disobey, you go against God. And then Fomin, this priest, says, and it's as if the Lord foresaw that he might falter at some point, Joshua, him, and the people, as long as Joshua strictly fulfilled this will of God, meaning killing people, then he fulfilled the commandment of God. So when he hesitated to kill, basically he disobeyed God. And then as soon as any faint-heartedness, sin, or fear appeared, as soon as someone started thinking, no, maybe we shouldn't kill them, the Lord for that sent defeat to the Jewish in battles and various other upheavals. So basically it's a message to the Russian soldiers. Look, this is the commandment of God. You go and kill. Because those people, Ukrainians, they are like canonized, like those pagans, whom God wants to be eliminated from the surface of earth. If you hesitate, if you have a slightest thought of kind of pitying them, you go against God. Right? This is the commandment. That is the message they want to deliver. Because if you hesitate, then you get defeated. Just like Joshua got defeated from in his mission. And then kind of summary of this conversation. When Korchennikov, this editor-in-chief, he says, national leaders were sued at their bell to testify thereby, which is the reference to Paul, that they are given the power to uphold the divine law. And that is, they have the right to punish, to cut short earthly destinies, and to give a person the opportunity to realize, even though such a terrible event as the loss of life. And now he refers people, president, God. We must know if we retreat from God, we will never see him again. And Fomin, his counterpart, he responds, we who know God, who know the true God, should follow this. So that is kind of the message that they take from the Bible. This is like the ancient battle of Israel against the powers of evil. And Russia now has substituted Israel. And Ukrainians are now like Canaanites. And our mission is to purge the land from the infidels, from the unclean, those unclean people. And if we don't, then we betray God. We go against God. God will hate us. Well, basically, that was exactly the same of kind of biblical hermeneutics that the Nazis applied to Jews. Exactly the same. No difference. And that's where we stand. You may make your conclusions yourself. This is the kind of where it ends. I took this picture in Oswiecim in Auschwitz, which is a result exactly of the same kind of biblical theology. Okay? That will be it. I'll be happy to take your questions. I think in the terms of timing, we are good, right?
We're good. Yeah. Yes, we are good. So we have opportunity for questions. Cyril, thank you very much for taking us through that panorama of issues, and we'll have time to explore them more deeply. I'll bring the mic to you. If you're happy to share your name, please do so, but there's no need to if you prefer your question to be anonymous.
Thank you. Bill Lee, thank you for your talk. It was wonderful to get an insight into what's happening in Ukraine that we kind of don't pick up from elsewhere. The hermeneutic that you presented, do you think that's widely accepted in the Russian Orthodox Church? Or do you think it's an abhorrent sort of deviation from what the congregation, at the congregation level, people would think?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Actually, it's not a singular case. This sort of hermeneutics, it stems from, I would say, from an entire school. It's Moscow Theological Academy, which used to be the main theological school of the Russian Orthodox Church. I myself, I used to teach there. I taught there. And I knew all those kind of professors who now produce a different sort of theology. It's like almost everyone does this in this school, particular school. And for example, there is a professor whose name is Osipov. He produces exactly the same kind of hermeneutics, and he's a super popular speaker. Like he produces podcasts and recordings, and they become viral. I mean, thousands of people would watch and follow them. Well, it's a big question to what extent this theology, kind of theology of the war, which is produced by the Russian Church, is really influencing people. It's very debatable because we simply don't know what the Russians think. Because I compare Russia with, camera obscura. In camera obscura, you may sit inside, you have like a tiny hole through which you can see the world. Like there is a beam of light through this hole. You can observe things, but from outside, no one can see what is inside, right? So the Russians sit somewhere in this camera obscura. They observe some parts of the world, but we can't see what is inside their heads. I can guess that the main motivation for most Russians is money, just money. It's very simple. For example, well, until the war, there was a huge differentiation between rich and poor in Russia. Like 80% of all Russian money circulated in Moscow. So Moscow is super rich. St. Petersburg is probably rich. But if you go like 1 hour, 2 hours from Moscow, and you'll find Middle Ages, literally, with no facilities, with very poor people. And this is the rest of Russia. So the soldiers are drawn exactly from the rest of Russia. So they would receive money they would never imagine they could have for fighting. And actually they are forced by their families to go to fight. Imagine a Russian wife whose husband is usually an alcoholic or drug addict, with a person with addiction problems. And she would say to him, look, there is no use of you here. Go and fight. If you come alive, you will bring money. If you get killed, you will bring even more money. And this is the main motivation. But for some people, just to kill for money is not enough. Some people want some kind of higher cause, as it were. Then the church comes in. And the church says, okay, these are the explanations why you should kill. Why you should not have any conscious issue, because it's completely justifiable. It's a sacred war. It's the biblical war. It's feel like King David or Solomon or ancient Israel, killing all the neighbors around you. And this it also works. I can see, for example, when we take prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war, and we interrogate them, and half of them would have really ideas why they killed. They came to fight. They had all those ideas that they heard also from the church. So that is the experience from interrogations.
Thanks, Cyril. Murray Ray. In the conversation you reported to us trying to find a theological justification for the work of colonialism, the conspicuous absence was any reference to Jesus. Is that typical in the theological justifications, or are there Christological framing of the
Excellent
issue
question.
as well?
Yes, indeed. There were studies that studied the sermons of Patriarch Cyril, the frequency of words that he uses in the sermons. And it's interesting that he makes a lot of reference to God, especially in connection with the predicatives like powerful God, strong God, and he makes only a few references to Jesus, which tells a lot, which explains so many things.
Hi. Thank you very much, Cyril. It was very interesting. I'm just your little your confession about your personal journey like kind of blew my mind, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how does one procure a job working for as a secretary for one of the most evil people in Russia, and how does a Ukrainian do it specifically? Yeah.
And actually, I have his name. I was named after him. Kirill is his name, actually. Yeah, among other things. Yes. Well, he's a very evil person, but he was not always like that. I sometimes compare Kirill with Citizen Kane. You remember the story of Orson Welles, the guy who was very good, like as a newspaper tycoon, and then he became evil. I believe there was a transformation with Kirill. When I started working with him, he was a very good person to work with, very interesting person to work, very charismatic, very open-minded. He was probably one of the most open-minded hierarchs in the Orthodox Church, I would say. And then he changed. I believe that the kind of time when he changed was within 3 years or so after he became the patriarch. That's when I last observed him. And I observed him changing, and then when I realized that he has becoming a very different person, I just quit my job and all my positions. Why he changed? It's a good question. I think it's an opportunism. It's an opportunity to gain more power and money. It's also an opportunism to be a prominent political leader. He sensed somehow, I think, this change of tide in the global policy towards more conservative shift, as it were. As a politician even though he's a hierarch, a patriarch, but he's a politician in his guts. With his guts feeling, he felt this kind of tide of anti-liberal counter-revolution, we would say, which is kind of in full-fledged nowadays. And he sensed it, and he realized, I think, that it's going to be the new thing, a new fashion, a new trend in the global politics. And he was right. And he wanted kind of to be a leader of this new wave. It's like, if you surf, you understand, you take the wave, you catch the wave. So he caught this wave, and he decided to ride it. And I think I believe that he actually inspired Putin to ride the same wave, because Putin never had big ideas. In KGB, Putin had a nickname, cigarette butt, because he's literally small, and he always had very small ideas. He was never able to think big, literally. Kirill, as I knew him, he was always able to think big, and I think he taught Putin to think big. He inspired him to explain himself, Russia, and the world in those terms of cosmic, battles and sacred wars and stuff. He saw in Putin and this changing of time, of the spirit of time, an opportunity for himself to become a prominent religious leader, maybe the religious leader #1 in the world. Of course, he failed epically, but that was at least his intention.
Elliot Holder, you mentioned in passing that Zelensky was partially elected due to Russian interference with a neo-colonialist aim. Are you able to elaborate on potentially what Putin's plan was and how he misjudged Zelensky?
I got it. Well, he was not elected with the help of Russia, certainly. He was elected clearly with the help of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians chose him, which I still don't understand because, well, like my family, most of my family voted for Zelensky. I never said no, but I had my own ideas. Because, well, people were already tired of the war, and Zelensky, promised things. He was a populist politician, basically, when he was elected. And Putin countered on that. He thought that he would be able to negotiate with Zelensky, essentially to negotiate the surrender. Yes, it was a surprise. I mean, it was not given. It was a surprise that Zelensky emerged as a really pro-Ukrainian politician. He's probably one of the most pro-Ukrainian politicians nowadays in Ukraine. Which is the same surprise as I experienced with Kirill. Well, Kirill used to be a very open-minded and eventually ended up as a very kind of opposite to himself. Zelensky became very opposite to himself when he was elected. And that was Putin's grave miscalculation, I think. When Putin realized this, he started the war, that he could not control Zelensky in the neo-colonial way. Of course, I think that pandemic also played its role. Because imagine an alpha dog being chained for 3 years in his bunker, full of energy and ideas, and he read a lot of books, which was dangerous, very bad, because he read a lot of conspiracy theories, and he had always a very superficial understanding of history. But he believed, all of a sudden, he came to believe that he's a great historian. Sometimes I use this argument as an argument for the need to have core curriculum of humanitarian and even theological studies in the modern university, because Putin was trained in the law school of Leningrad University at the time, Leningrad, without proper humanitarian training, and he became an amateur historian with all the consequences like this. If he were trained properly, if he had curriculum of theology and religious studies and history properly, when he was trained as a lawyer, it would have been a big difference. So he was sitting in the bunker, reading those books, developing those historical ideas that he now tries to lecture every time he meets political leaders like, I don't know, Trump's envoys. He always lectures them on history, which is very boring. But yes, after the pandemic was over, he felt released. Imagine a big dog, very energetic dog being unchained. So he went to run and to bite and to destroy.
Hi. Could you give me your opinion about the difference between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? And secondly, are they both members of the World Council of Churches?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good.
And why does the World Council of Churches not put Cyril to shame?
Yeah. Well, you just nail it. I believe. Because, you've triggered me because I'm very critical about the WCC standing on the war in Ukraine. Well, in Ukraine we have two Orthodox churches nowadays, and they compete one another. One is the kind of ex-Moscow Patriarchate, probably slightly still Moscow Patriarchate. Another one is independent, autocephalous church. They don't usually like each other, but there's a different story. And they both are different from the Russian Orthodox Church. Russian Orthodox Church is really totalitarian. Well, you may imagine Russia as a very totalitarian society. So imagine within this totalitarian society, a very totalitarian environment, which is called the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, I've lived there inside, and I know how it was. It's really, I could attest that the Russian Orthodox Church is much more tougher, stiffer than even the Russian society. In Ukraine, it's not the case. Both churches, they can hate each other. I mean, both Ukrainian churches can hate each other, fight each other, but they are not totalitarian. That's the difference. As regards the WCC, the Russian Orthodox Church is a very active member of the WCC. And There were discussions just before the General Assembly in Karlsruhe in 2022, as you probably know, to kick out the Russian Church from the WCC, and all those discussions were just suppressed. As a result, nowadays, especially after for example, the Central Committee in Johannesburg, the Russians were treated exactly like Putin was treated in Anchorage by Trump, red carpet treatment. They invited to participate in all commissions. They very actively participate. They use this, of course, as an opportunity because they perceive the WCC as a megaphone to deliver their messages to the global south, and they do it very well. The WCC says that we do this in order to preserve the dialogue, in order to preserve their partnership. I believe it is the same kind of policy as what the enablers do to the victims of rape and killing. It's enabling the perpetrator, what they do. It's not the dialogue. Of course, in the name of the dialogue, yes, it's understandable, dialogue is needed. That's the purpose of the WCC. But sometimes dialogue can be a way to enable a perpetrator. That's what is happening. Well, just one example, and it's a very sad example. The Russians stealing Ukrainian kids. They kidnapped Ukrainian kids. So after the big war started, they started deporting to Russia Ukrainian kids, saying that, well, telling them that your parents are killed or they don't want you anymore, so come to Russia. And then when they come to Russia, the Russians change their names, sometimes even the date of birth, in order to make it impossible to identify those kids later on. The Russians themselves report that around 700,000 kids were brought from Ukraine to the Russian territory. Usually they get re-educated. So they're punished if they speak Ukrainian language. I receive reports. I receive really secret messages from the Russian side through different secret channels. They explain what is happening there. And the reports say that the Russian church and the Chechen Kadyrov kind of army are the cruelest in treating the Ukrainian kids. Even the state agencies of Russia are more kind of humane. The church is very cruel in re-educating the Ukrainian kids in Russia. Some of them are educated to become soldiers. They join the so-called Army of Youth, which has now around 1.8 million children, teenagers, and which is the army of the future. So in 5 years, imagine they will be army, regular army. The question is fighting where? Everywhere. This process of kind of training those kids as soldiers, as Russians, goes with the direct input of the Russian Orthodox Church and with the blessing of the WCC, because they visit those facilities and they get invitations from the Russian Orthodox Church. They go there in the name of the partnership, and basically they cover up this re-education. It's very similar. I showed this picture from Auschwitz. There is a museum in Auschwitz. And part of the exhibition is how the international organizations during the World War II were invited actually to visit the place. And they showed them, the bright side of this camp. There was a bright side as it was kind of projected, constructed by the Nazis. And those people from the international organizations would come to Oswiecim, Auschwitz, and would be shown, maybe some kids, looking healthy, or maybe this band that played music, and would return, happy. That's what is happening now with those camps and the WCC.
Still got some time, but it would be useful to know how many questions there still are in the room, just so we can get to them. Another question from Heike.
What's your personal mission? Why are you here?
To tell those stories.
Pardon?
To tell those stories. To deliver those stories from the first-hand experience.
But you are not just an academic. You're a human being too, and you're.
Yeah, I believe I don't appear just an academic. Well, my mission, because I try to put my hands on everything that I'm telling. That's why I've been to the front line. I visited all those kind of distracted cities. I've spoken to all those people who suffered, and that's why I go to places like Timor-Leste or Cambodia or Congo, where people still suffer from genocide, because I believe that in Ukraine we can really understand the tragedies in those places. I sometimes explain that people in the West, they have a lot of sympathy and empathy to those who suffer, but empathy has limitations. You cannot really walk in the shoes of someone if you haven't walked it yourself. And that's why I explained to the people in the Global South, look, you perceive us, Ukraine, as a part of the Global West, and you perceive us like American puppets, and you say that we are just fighting just one imperial war against another imperial power, and what do we have to do with all this? And I say, look, if we are a part of the Global West, okay, but then in the Global West, we are the only nation that can understand what you've gone through. We are the only nation, because all other nations in the Global West, maximum they may have is empathy, which is fading away anyways nowadays. Well, no one is interested anymore. Yeah, we are going through this. It's we may appear like smiling, and because we try to live our normal life. If we concentrate on the war, we get mad. But it doesn't mean that there is nothing behind us, And that's what I try tell you, bring this testimony.
Hi, Cyril. Thank you for your talk. Going off of what you just said, one of the things that I have heard recently in commentary about Ukraine is that when we applaud or praise Ukraine for their resilience, that can kind of disincentivize or make the rest of the world step back and not provide aid or support, especially for the church around the world. What would you wish our response to be?
Yeah. Well, yes, of course we say that we try to resist, and we do. I mean, it's impossible what we do. We are ourselves surprised by ourselves. But of course, yes, how it may work in the world outside that, okay, you do it. Go ahead. Continue doing. You are well off without us. Well, I should say in Ukraine, there is, we don't have questions about the Russians. We have decided a long time ago. That's why we don't even discuss it among ourselves. But I think there is, of course, there is a huge trauma which is caused by this. And I would say Ukraine is will be experiencing this pandemic of PTSD and all sorts of traumas. I would say we are now, I observe it, kind of sort of trauma against the Western reactions are growing. When you see the European powers like Hungary or Slovakia, openly working with Putin. When you see Trump's America, which is kind of, I say, look what is Trump and Putin. They are like two gangsters. They stop you on the highway. One keeps a gun at your head, and another robs you. That's what they do. They're two gangsters, basically. And it's like this frustration, we now try to cope with this frustration, with the lack of support or empathy. Probably we can live without that. Yeah, probably. There will be bitterness that we always thank, try to be nice. It doesn't mean that we don't register what is happening. We do register. But for our survival, we need to be nice. But it's not always sincere, I should say.
Cyril, I mentioned in my introduction to you that your institutional affiliation is Los Angeles, but am I correct? You spend most of your time in Ukraine itself?
That's correct, yes. That's what I call home, and that's, I usually call the place where I live, I measure it by the airports from which I fly most frequently. Nowadays, I cannot fly from Ukraine. I usually take a taxi to Moldova, to Chisinau. It takes like 10 hours, a taxi drive from the next airport available. It's still Ukraine, but I spend a lot of time traveling. I try to travel across the Global South in the last 2 years or so. So I've done it like in Africa, in Asia, including like Indonesia, and now in Oceania. And I considered my mission kind of to bring this message to the Global South and to establish kind of better understanding between us and the Global South. I believe Australia and New Zealand are probably the best places where Global South and Global West meet, because you have this double identity, right? And probably you are in the best position to facilitate this dialogue between the things which seem to be so remote nowadays, Global South and Global West. And we need this kind of dialogue, this kind of rapprochement.
We probably have time for a final question, if there is one. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I just want to take this opportunity to make a little PSA. So if you'd like to support Ukraine, if you'd like to support local Ukrainian community, I'm a member of it, and we have a little group of people that gather every Saturday at the Octagon at midday, and we stand there with flags. You'll see the flags. So if you ever feel like coming in and just saying hi and discussing this, learning more about it, learning about the ways you can donate in a safe, secure way to Ukraine, anything like that, just come and show yourself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that is a good segue that you may or may not be aware that this evening is an important day in Dunedin history. The Honorary Consul is being installed tonight. We're very grateful to those of you who might have had split loyalties between being involved in that and coming here, that you've made the choice so far at least of coming here. It's great to see you. The ambassador is in Dunedin for that event, and tomorrow at noon we'll be speaking in Archway 3 on a panel organised by our politics colleagues. So that's an open event. Do come in tomorrow at noon, Archway 3, if you'll be interested in that event tomorrow. If you're interested particularly on the religious and ethical issues, Cyril will be speaking again at 3 o'clock tomorrow to the Theology seminar, and that's in Castle D, and that's an open seminar if you wish to come to that. But for this evening, I think we've been fascinated and challenged and provoked to think more deeply by Cyril. I think you mentioned to me that Hovorun means many words. Is that correct?
It means someone who speaks a lot, yes.
Someone who speaks a lot. And Cyril has lived up to his surname tonight. We are very grateful to you for sharing not just your words, but these powerful images, for challenging us to keep thinking and wrestling with these issues, Ukraine, post-colonialism, and some quite, to my mind, horrifying biblical theology. Please join me in thanking Cyril for his presentation.